Now these are the important steps which we have discussed earlier in the class, and these are the lung volumes and lung capacities, and now this is the exchange of gases and the factors that plays important role in the exchange of gases, and how the pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide is varying in different places from alveoli to the tissues. This also we have discussed, and this is how the exchange of gas or oxygen and carbon dioxide takes place in the alveolar cavity, and this is how the exchange of gases and transportation of gases from the alveoli to the tissues and again back to the alveoli, that is to the lungs. And this is what is called the external respiration, that is the exchange of gas in the lungs, and this is the internal respiration. And this is here the internal respiration takes place. Okay. Now, before going into the details, let us have a discussion on the pH scale. We know the hydrogen ion concentration can be measured by a scale known as the pH scale. Now, pH refers to the concentration of hydrogen ions. If the hydrogen ion concentration is more, the pH value will be less. That means at 1 or 2. Remember, the strong acids will have more hydrogen ions, hence they are placed in the pH scale at the lowest range. So this is how the low pH means high concentration of hydrogen ions. You should write these points in the notes. Low pH scale means a high hydrogen ion concentration, and high hydrogen ions means a low pH. Low pH means at 1 or 2. So this is the low pH, means strong acidic. And low ionic concentration, low hydrogen ion concentration means high pH. That means in the range of 13 and 14, which means strong base. So remember, high concentration of hydrogen ions means low pH value. Low pH value means around 1, 2, 3. So this is called the low pH. So pH values increases from 1 to 14 at low pH values. That means at 1 and 2 we have more hydrogen ion concentration. At high pH values means 12 to 14 we have very low hydrogen ion concentration. This you have to remember, because this makes sense in the next discussion. And now the transportation of gases. What are the chief gases that are transported? One is the oxygen, another one is carbon dioxide. And in this class, we are going to discuss about how the oxygen is transported. We all know that the blood is the important factor in the transportation of gases. So for both the oxygen as well as the carbon dioxide, the blood is the chief transporter. And during the oxygen transportation, almost 3% of the oxygen is transported through the plasma. You know, the blood consists of a liquid matrix known as the plasma, and around 3% of the oxygen is transported in the dissolved state through this plasma. But 97% of the oxygen is transported by the red blood cells or the RBC in the blood. You know, RBC having a very important pigment known as hemoglobin. So this hemoglobin present in the red blood cells or the RBC binds with the oxygen and transports the oxygen molecules. So the hemoglobin is denoted as HB. HB means hemoglobin. And remember, this hemoglobin is a pigment, respiratory pigment containing iron metal, iron ion in its structure. And each molecule of hemoglobin is capable of transporting 4 oxygen molecules. So this is a very important thing you have to remember. So hemoglobin, one molecule of hemoglobin is capable of carrying a maximum of 4 oxygen molecules. And hemoglobin binds with the oxygen or combines with the oxygen to form oxyhemoglobin. You know, the 4 oxygen molecules combine with hemoglobin and forms oxyhemoglobin. And this oxyhemoglobin is a bright red in color. Hemoglobin, when combined with oxygen, it turns into a very bright red. So this indicates that oxygen is combined with hemoglobin. And this process is also known as the saturation or the oxygenation of hemoglobin. So hemoglobin combines with 4 molecules of oxygen gives rise to HbO24 or oxyhemoglobin. Remember, this reaction is reversible. So in the alveoli, this reaction takes place and it is reversible. That means hemoglobin, oxyhemoglobin will be dissociated to give hemoglobin and oxygen, which occurs at the tissues. You know, the oxygen must be delivered to the tissues. So this reversible reaction is a very, very important one. And there are certain factors which favors the binding of oxygen to the hemoglobin. And these factors are carbon dioxide, temperature, and pH value. And of course, the concentration of oxygen is also an important one. I have not written this factor here in the PPT. You just write down there are 4 factors that favors the binding of oxygen with hemoglobin, or simply we can say the oxygenation of the hemoglobin. Now these factors are partial pressure of oxygen, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, low temperature and the hydrogen ions concentration. And we can observe the formation of oxyhemoglobin through a graph known as oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve gives us an explanation in relation to the percentage of hemoglobin that combined with oxygen and the partial pressure of the oxygen. Now let us see, this is the curve, oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. So here in the y-axis, we represent the hemoglobin saturation. Saturation means how much percentage of hemoglobin combined with oxygen. Here the percentage of hemoglobin starting from 0 to 100. In the x-axis, we represent the pressure, partial pressure of the oxygen in terms of mm of Hg, ranging from 0 to 100 plus. So if you see here, when the oxygen pressure increases, almost most of the hemoglobin gets saturated. So we get a curve which represents the S shape. Hence it is known as the sigmoid curve. If you see here, we are increasing the partial pressure of the oxygen, and you see at around 100 mm of Hg, you see how much hemoglobin is saturated. So here almost the maximum amount of hemoglobin is saturated. That means around 97% of the hemoglobin is gets saturated. After this 100 mm of Hg, that is 100 mm of Hg of the partial pressure of the oxygen, there is no increase in the saturation because almost 97% of the hemoglobin saturates. That means it combines with oxygen and forms oxyhemoglobin. Now, when the pressure of the oxygen decreases, the percentage of the hemoglobin also gets reduced. So, you know that in the alveoli, we have a partial pressure of around 100 mm of Hg with respect to the oxygen. But when it reaches the tissues, it almost gets reduced to 40 mm of Hg. So we can say at 40 mm of Hg, almost only 70% of the oxygen is saturated. That means at tissues, around 22% of the oxygen will be given to the tissues. And oxygen dissociation curve gives an indication how the impact of carbon dioxide, oxygen, temperature, and the hydrogen ions will be on the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation. Now let us see what are the factors that are favoring the formation or the binding of oxygen to the hemoglobin. You see, the oxygen will combine with hemoglobin at the alveoli or at the lungs. At the lungs, we have a high partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So what are the factors that are responsible for the formation of oxyhemoglobin at alveoli? Is if one is high partial pressure of oxygen. We know around 100 mm of Hg is there in the alveoli. And now the low carbon dioxide pressure, and at alveoli the temperature is also very low, and we have very low hydrogen ions in the blood in the alveoli. That means it is high pH. That means high pH. So these are the factors that favors the formation of oxygen, oxyhemoglobin. That means saturation of the hemoglobin takes place. Now, what happens? You see, a shift to the right means formation of oxyhemoglobin. Shift to the right means the oxyhemoglobin will be dissociated. At tissues, what happens? There is an increased carbon dioxide pressure. We know the carbon dioxide pressure at the tissues is high. around 45 mm of Hg. So during the pressure, high pressure, what happens? The oxyhemoglobin dissociates to form hemoglobin and oxygen. And this is favored by one, the carbon dioxide pressure, increased pressure, and the temperature is also at tissues is high, and the hydrogen ions concentration is also high. That means we have very low pH. Here in the alveoli we have high pH. So the conditions that occur in the tissues is quite opposite to the factors or the conditions that occur at the alveoli. So now what happens? It shifts to the right. Shifting to the right means the oxygen and hemoglobin is dissociated. So around the partial pressure of the oxygen in the tissues is only 40 when compared to the 100 in the alveoli. Now what happens? At 40, around 70% of the hemoglobin is only saturated. That means 22% of the oxygen is available to the tissues. Remember, not all the oxygen is given to the tissues. Even though it is 97% saturated at the alveoli, but at the tissues only around 75% is saturated. That means around 22% of the oxygen is given to the tissues. That means around 75% of the hemoglobin still attaching the oxygen. This is known as the reserve amount of oxygen that is available with the hemoglobin. That means not all the oxygen is given to the tissues. Only 22% of the oxygen of the 97% saturated is given to the tissues. So around 75% at the at pressure of 40 mm of Hg of oxygen is still attached to the hemoglobin, and this is known as the reserve amount, which is available for about 4 to 5 minutes, even though a man cannot breathe. So in case of skeletal muscles, the hemoglobin gives more oxygen during the vigorous exercises. Around 62% at 20 mm of Hg. In the skeletal muscles, what happens? 62% of the around 62% of the oxygen will be given at 20 mm of Hg of partial pressure of oxygen. That means in the skeletal muscles, during exercise, the oxygen pressure will be very low at around 20% of 20 mm of Hg. So at this partial pressure in the skeletal muscles, almost 62% of the oxygen will be available for the skeletal muscles because of extra energy that needs to be liberated. So this amount of oxygen is known as the unloading pressure of the oxygen in the skeletal muscles. That means let us tell you once again that in normal tissues we have 40 mm of Hg. The partial pressure of oxygen is around 40 mm of Hg, and during that what happens? 75% is saturated. Only 22% of oxygen will be given. But in case of skeletal muscles which undergo a very vigorous exercise, you need to have lot of oxygen. So the partial pressure of the oxygen in the skeletal muscle is around 20 mm of Hg. So almost 62% of the 62% of the oxygen will be given to the skeletal tissues. So that means this 20 mm of Hg is known as the unloading tension of the skeletal muscles. So skeletal muscles needs a lot of energy. So in tune of that, what happens, more amount of oxygen will be given to the skeletal tissues when compared to the normal tissues. So the 75% of the oxygen is still attached to the hemoglobin, which is a reserve oxygen. That means in case a human is not, if he is not capable of breathing for 3 or 4 minutes, still he can use this oxygen that is available as a reserve. Now another important factor is the Bohr effect. So Bohr effect means the effect of partial pressure of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions on the affinity of the hemoglobin. So this is how the Bohr effect will explain us how the pressure of the carbon dioxide and the hydrogen ion concentration will impact the oxygenation of the hemoglobin, and the impact of this oxygen affinity on hemoglobin is known as the Bohr effect. If you see here, around 100 mm of Hg of PO2, all the 9 hemoglobin, that is 97% of the hemoglobin is saturated. At PO2 of 40 mm of Hg, that means that is at the tissues, hemoglobin is around 75% saturated. That means only 22% of the oxygen is available to the tissues. That means around 1/5 of the oxygen will be given, and the remaining 4/5 of the oxygen will be in the form of reserve in the tissues. So the remaining 4/5 of the oxygen is called the reserve. That means the 75% of the of the hemoglobin attaches to the oxygen. But in case of certain tissues like skeletal muscles, which involves vigorous exercise, that means you need more oxygen, the unloading tension of the oxyhemoglobin, will be more unloading tension. That means more amount of oxygen will be made available to the skeletal tissues, and almost 62% of oxygen at the pressure of 20 mm of Hg of PO2 will be given. That means at resting position, only 70% of the oxygen is with hemoglobin, whereas only 20, a few, that means only 35% of hemoglobin is saturated. So that means the reserve, that means the 75% of hemoglobin with oxygen is capable of supplying oxygen for surviving for around 4 to 5 minutes, even a heart stops or breathing is interrupted. So this is what is about the transportation of gases. Hope you understood well.